What's going on, guys? Hope everybody's doing well today. So on June 15, 2015, my little brother took his life. At the time, he was a member of the U.S. Air Force. I never realized how common suicide was with service members. I never truly understood suicide. You know, how people can deal with certain shit and they feel like they have nobody to talk to. If I'm being completely honest, my thoughts on suicide in general have changed. You know, I'm 35 years old now, and it's crazy to think that my brother's life stopped at 23 years old, and he would have turned 34 on February 28th of this year. You know, me and him were a year and 3 days apart. You know, where his life ended truly at a point where life is really getting started. There's not a moment throughout the day that I don't think about him. You know, it's so weird when you spend your entire life knowing a person, talking to them, you know, texting them, phone calls, going to visit them, and then one day they're no longer here. You know, where it's hard to wrap your brain around that. You know, and I'm at a position now where I've dealt with it. You know, I've done the therapy. I have a better understanding of suicide and why people do it, and how to understand that it wasn't personal. The craziest part about suicide is people take their life because they're dealing with something that they don't feel that they can overcome. And that act is a way for them to escape whatever they're dealing with, but they then transfer that pain to everyone who's ever come in contact with them. I still run into people today who knew my brother, and they didn't know that that's the way his life ended. You know, it's crazy how life plays out sometimes. I think oftentimes we as people take people and moments for granted. You know, we think that that person's always going to be around, that when we want to tell them something, or we want to show them how much we care for them, how much they mean to us, that sometimes we don't say those things because we say, well, there's always tomorrow. Me and my brother had this restaurant that we would go to, and it was kind of like a tradition where the last night that I was in town, we would go there and get the same thing we always got. And that Sunday night, we went to this restaurant, and, you know, I didn't think anything of it. You know, for how many every years we would go to this restaurant, he didn't have much of an appetite. You know, he got like some cheese curds and a Sprite. And again, I didn't think anything of it. He was in good spirits, joking, laughing, you know, talking about whatever. But I had this voice come across me that said, take a picture of your brother. And it was such a weird, like a weird voice, you know. I'm not going to say it was God speaking to me. I'm not sure what it was, but it was a voice that said, pull your phone out and take a picture of your brother. And I remember thinking, like, that's weird. Like, I'm not pulling my phone out and taking a photo of him. And just to think how the course of that night went, and then waking up the next morning to find out that my brother's no longer here on this earth. You know, like those moments, I think about that. I can't tell you how many times a day I think about that I should have just taken that photo. You know, I remember maybe a month before my brother passed away, he texted me about wanting some pictures of our dad. And I remember him saying he forgot what our dad looked like. And it wasn't until maybe 6 years ago that I finally understood what he meant, you know. You know, I think back to, I don't have a lot of photos of my brother. You know, I don't have very many photos of me and him together, you know, as adults. And I always go back to that conversation of, can you send photos of dad? Because I'm starting to forget what he looked like. And, you know, I hope that one day I don't have that same thought of, I forgot what my brother looked like. We had this dream that we would buy our dad's property. You know, we had this dream where he'll build a house on one end of the property, I'll build a house on the other. You know, our kids can grow up living the life that we enjoyed. You know, my brother loved horses, and, you know, he wanted to raise horses. I've always been, I wouldn't say anti horses, but, you know, when it comes to farm animals, horses are at the bottom of that list. It's crazy to think that I'm farming, living the dream that we talked about, but I'm doing it by myself. There's so much cool shit that I've done and places that I've been, people that I've met, you know, that I think it just would have been cool for him to be able to experience that. You know, I think one day I'm gonna have kids and they're not gonna know just how cool their uncle was. About a month before he took his life, he wanted to go deep sea fishing. You know, I'd never been. You know, he loved fishing. You know, fishing was something that that we done a lot with our dad. And something happened with my work schedule. I remember texting him saying that I couldn't make it because of my work schedule. And, you know, he was like, yeah, that's cool. You know, we'll go another time. And, you know, I just think back to, if I'd known things would have played out the way they played out, I would have said the hell with that job. And I'm going deep sea fishing with my brother. But, you know, that's always like hindsight, where in the moment you're kind of just living to get by, just living to have some money, pay bills and stuff like that, that you lose track of certain things. That you get so caught up in working, trying to make money, that you put things off for another day. You know, and my dad was notorious for doing that. You know, there were so many things when we were kids where we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that. And he kept putting those things off. And then ultimately we never ended up doing any of that because things would come up, you know, not making time for things that were important to a certain degree. You know, I just wanted to share some thoughts here. Make sure the people that you love know that you love them. You know, make sure you're checking on your friends and family. You know, I understand life can get busy at times. You know, understand that as you get older, you start developing your own life. And then those relationships with friends can sometimes go by the wayside. I'm not going to say I haven't had suicidal thoughts. You know, I thought about it shortly after my brother done it. Just being very, just depression, you know, drinking too much, trying to drink the pain away. You know, I remember doing that time. I was smoking about 2 packs of cigarettes a day, in a way of, I want to die, you know, a type of pain that I just didn't understand how to overcome. I think that's where purpose comes in at. Having something that's bigger than yourself, something that drives you, something that forces you to get out of bed, that you have to accomplish. I was able to use that energy that hurt for something good. You know, I ended up starting a nonprofit organization that works with beginning farmers, military veterans, in honor of my brother. You know, that doesn't happen if he doesn't take his life. You know, there's always a silver lining in everything. Like in the moment, things just don't make any sense. And it's not until you get so far removed from the moment and you're able to reflect back on that moment that there's a little more clarity. You know, I would have given my business up and given all these goats up, my truck, just to have my brother back on this earth. Don't take life for granted, you know, because you never really know when that moment will be your last. So if there's some girl out there that you want to talk to, man, go talk to her. Trust me, in 100 years, no one's going to know you even existed anyways. So the worst thing that she can say is, I'm not interested. And that just opens up the door for new opportunities. If there's a business that you want to start it. Don't put things on the back burner for, well, I'll do it next month, I'll do it next year. I'll do it when this aligns with my life. You are here on this earth for a purpose. Don't waste it. If there's someone out there right now who's going through a lot of shit, don't feel like you're alone. Like, you do have people around you. You do have people around you who love you, who care for you. Just, we as people, we're terrible at voicing our feelings for each other. You know, you see it all the time when someone passes away. Gone too soon. I love them. That's when you hear all the praise for that person. You know, but oftentimes we keep that bottled up inside when that person is around to be able to hear it. So no matter how alone in this moment you feel, always remember there are people out there who care for you. And I get it. Life is tough at times, but don't feel like you have to take your life in order to ease your pain. Because ultimately, all you're really doing is transferring that pain to everyone you ever come in contact with. But anyways, guys, as always, thank you for watching. Thank you for all the new subscribers, and we'll catch you on the next one.